Hi, friends, and welcome to the third Young Adult Advocacy Training hosted by Secours Young Adults. Whether this is your first session or your third time joining us, we're really thankful that you're here. Before we get started, we do want to do a quick shameless plug. You can find more information for us or the previous recordings from the advocacy trainings or information about our upcoming events on our Facebook and Instagram page, which is at Secours Young Adults. The charism of Bon Secours are compassion, healing, and liberation, which are three pillars that we hope to embody each week as we navigate our time together. Compassion and thought and action, healing in our world, and liberation for those facing injustice. So with that in mind, this evening, our opening prayer is going to be one written by Richard Scott from Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C. So we're going to begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I pray for healing in Ferguson. I pray for healing in Minneapolis. I pray for healing in New York. I pray for healing in Baltimore. I pray that we will continue to run for Ahmaud. I pray that we will blast our music for Jordan. I pray that we will continue to kneel for Cap. I pray the police will stop killing us. I pray that 911 is a beacon of safety, not death. I pray that the next time I raise my hands are raising it in the classroom. I pray that the voices of the unheard are amplified. I pray that the color of my skin won't get me killed. I pray that Martin's death doesn't become a nightmare. I pray that Rose's bravery isn't blinded by cowards. I pray that Maya's words are never erased. I pray for change. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our speaker this evening is Darius Villalobos, the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the National Federation of Catholic Youth Ministry. And if you think that title is impressive, be sure to read his full bio. Darius has served in every role there is for a layperson in the church. I'm not joking at all. It's very, very impressive. And he is our resident expert on ways to enhance Catholic values of inclusion, diversity, and human dignity. Those are my words. He's far too humble to call himself an expert. But please give Darius a muted round of applause as we welcome him to our Zoom screens tonight.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's a real gift and honor to be invited to share with you guys this evening. And as Lauren shared, I'm really blessed to be able to have done work in lots of different settings and lots of different parts of the church, but I feel particularly privileged in my current role because it's really an intersection of two things that I think are really near and dear to my heart. The first being working with young people. I was born and raised in Chicago. I am a product of really great mentorship and really great ministry in the church. And so I'm really fond of wanting to give back and wanting to give back to our young people because they're not just the future, they're our present, and they have so much to offer the church. Secondly, the interconnection of diversity and particularly cultural diversity has been something very near and dear to me. I am blessed and really grateful to say I have lots of friends and lots of people who have mentored me from different backgrounds, from different communities, from all over the spectrum that makes up our diverse United States, our diverse church, and growing up in Chicago, you know, the diverse realities of a really big town and a very diverse town, but also one that shares in the struggles, particularly around segregation and social issues around where communities are and how communities are supported. So my hope for this evening is to just be able to offer some starting points for reflection, give you guys some practical tools and some context, and then hopefully be able to answer as many of your questions in allowing for dialogue and also for learning. I often joke and people say, no, you're too modest, but I don't consider myself an expert in this area, particularly the expert of dealing with racism, particularly in the context of the church. My work really does intersect with it though a lot. And so there's a lot of wisdom here. It's great to see some familiar faces and some friends, and also some new faces as well. So I'm going to invite, particularly in the chat, for people to share their comments, their wisdoms. If you have resources that you want to share or highlight, definitely open to that. But let's make this as much of a dialogue and conversation as it is a training for the evening. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to do two things really quick to make sure this works the way it's supposed to. You know how Zoom is, so bear with me. Okay, so on your screen, you should see the opening slide, and I wanted to highlight this prayer just because I think it's really important to have a little bit of context of where this was from. Richard is a young man who is a high schooler at Gonzaga High School in Washington, D.C. I got to meet Richard virtually in the last couple of weeks. He actually participated in a webinar that NFCYM did, inviting young people, youth and young adults, to talk about their experience of addressing racism in their own communities. And Richard wrote this poem in his school, and it was nominated and highlighted and awarded for the content of his piece. And I highlight it because issues like racism can seem very overwhelming. And we can often ask ourselves the question, what do I have to offer to this? What can I do? And I'm often reminded of this important scripture passage, which is near and dear to my heart, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12. Let no one have contempt for your youth, but set an example for those who believe in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. No matter how old we are, no matter how young we are, we have something to contribute into witnessing to the gospel. And so Richard stands out to me as a young person who is using his voice for good and using this to address these issues. So one of the key things that I'm noticing in this current moment and in this movement is that it's often young people who are really taking the lead in addressing these conversations. And I think for all of us, whether we're young or old, can recognize that we all have a piece to be able to offer into this conversation and into this important work. So tonight we're going to do three things. We're going to talk a little bit about what the church says about racism. We're going to talk about some of the challenges and the opportunities to addressing racism in the Catholic Church, and then answer the really important question, what can I do in this work? So what does the church say about racism? The church has actually been talking about racism for a long time, particularly in our US context. The first pastoral letter written by the US bishops actually was written in 1979, brothers and sisters to us. It's not a long letter, it's a very short letter, but it's very succinct and it's very clear in what it teaches about what the Catholic Church says on this issue. And throughout the years, many different bishops and the Conference of Bishops itself have addressed this, even most recently as of 2018, where a committee was put together by the USCCB in light of the riots that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this pastoral letter really came to address racism in our current context. And so if you're not familiar with these documents, definitely would highlight going to the USCCB page and viewing them. I'll also share a little bit in a minute on something that summarizes the pastoral letter. But I also want to highlight the one that's listed 6 here because I think it's really important. The document, What We've Seen and Heard, is the pastoral letter on evangelization from the Black bishops of the United States. There is something really important about listening to the voices of those who are most affected by the issues of racism. And I think this letter does an amazing job of both lifting up the challenges, but also the gifts of the community. And I really think that's an important thing we have to do in this moment as church, is make sure that we're lifting up those voices, to make sure that we're listening to them, but also not just listening to the struggles, but also to the many, many gifts that they have, because that is one of our gifts in diversity, is recognizing that every community, every cultural family, every ethnicity has gifts that we can learn from and dialogue from as we grow and develop and mature in our own faith. The bishops in their most recent document define racism in a few different ways, and I want to just highlight them because I think it's important to know what some of the definitions are within our church language. This first definition really highlights racism from a personal and individual standpoint. It's when we either consciously or unconsciously hold a person because of their race, their ethnicity, the way they look. We judge them and we hold them not of equal regard, being inferior. And this is stated very clearly in the document as a sin. This is sinful. Racism is a sin. And it occurs because we fundamentally miss the truth that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God. And so all of us have dignity in just who we are and how God has created us to be. Individual racist attitudes, though, are not the only way that racism manifests itself. Too often we have to struggle and really deal with the challenge of institutions and structures that hold racism up and often are to the benefit of certain individuals and are detrimental to others. In the document, they point out too often racism comes in the form of the sin of omission, when individuals, communities, and even churches remain silent and fail to act against racial injustice when it's encountered. Systemic racism is working in all sorts of ways, and they specifically point to the example of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, where those policies were created particularly to the negative effect of those who were African American in that community, a reality that is still something that is being struggled with in that area of the country today. And so these systems of oppression often exacerbate those individual feelings, those individual beliefs of racism, and even worse, they make them part of the norm of society. I want to point out this letter from Bishop Anthony Taylor, because it's one of the few letters that specifically has come out from a bishop to address the issue of Black Lives Matter. You know, he talks about the fact that Black Lives Matter as a movement is offering us today an opportunity to really address the injustices that are embedded in our society. And he also points out that most of us are aware of these disadvantages that are realities in Black America, but we tend to describe these disadvantages as internal factors within the community, rather than missing the point that if Black lives really did matter as much as white lives, our society would be structured completely differently. So I think there's a real challenge for us to sort of recognize, like, what is it that we are being called to do? Now, I want to highlight before I move on to this part, just something that kind of summarizes what the pastoral letter brings to the conversation. The pastoral letter, it's not very long, and it's not a complete document. It's not going to address all of the issues, all of the realities of racism, particularly in our current context today, which I think has been really magnified and has really shown some of the flaws and some of the challenges that we have. But I want to share the short video that was put together by Catholic Mobilizing Network. They are partners for us in ministry. We've worked together with them on a number of different projects and webinars on this particular topic. But the reason I share this video is I think it sums up really well some of the key points that we have to wrestle with that come out of the pastoral letter. So if you give me one moment, I will change my screen and there we go. Okay, sorry, couldn't find the mute button. Thank you, Nick. I will. There we go. Presenter mode is always tricky on these things, even with two monitors. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities to talk about racism within the Catholic Church. One of the biggest challenges that I think we struggle with, and it's named really well by the professor and theologian Father Brian Massengale, reflects some of the realities of why it's difficult to have these conversations within the larger US society as well. He names three things that I think are particularly important to name. We don't know what we're talking about when we talk about racism. And that's talking about language. We don't know what we are trying to really address when we speak about these issues. Everyone comes at it from different perspectives, from different experiences, and we're all trying to define things that can really be challenging for us to understand and wrestle with. We don't know how to talk about it. We are not good at having some of these difficult conversations. One is because of our own lack of practice, but also because they're very uncomfortable conversations. And the language that we use becomes sometimes a challenge or a detriment for us wanting to enter into those conversations. So because of our fear of using the wrong term to identify a person or a group of individuals, we don't say anything. Because we're afraid that we're going to offend, we often keep silent. And this becomes part of the problem, that because we're not comfortable having the conversations, we don't have the conversations at all. And the reality is, we don't really want to talk about this issue either. It's amazingly uncomfortable, particularly when we feel like we don't have the adequate understanding and knowledge and language to go about it. And so it's a particular challenge for us to even want to enter into these spaces, because it's going to force us to wrestle with truths that sometimes we don't want to hear, sometimes that we're not comfortable examining and working with. And it often requires us to look at some of the difficulties, the ugliness, and the challenges that we have within our own communities and within our own church context. The church has its own challenges when it comes to its own history with racism. From the earliest colonies here in the Americas, whether it was in North America or South America, the church was part of what came over from Europe. And European priests and clergy were part of those groups that helped to enslave the indigenous, who brought slaves from Africa and put people to enslavement to work the different crops, the different areas there. And the church was very complicit in that. That isn't me speaking out of turn, that's a historical fact. And there's a long history of people who've looked at the church's complacency in this early part, to the point where there were papal bulls written that talked about the indigenous people and African people as not human beings, they didn't have souls. And so it was okay to justify them being made slaves and being put into enslavement. So that's a challenge that we have to look at in our own history and how that has affected those particular communities here in the Americas. We have our own history when it comes to the institutions that we have. Georgetown University is a really great and really powerful example of a Catholic institution that has had to reckon with its past. The Maryland Jesuits had slaves. They were slave owners, and as part of the way to be able to keep Georgetown University open at some point, actually sold slaves so that they could be able to pay their bills to keep the institution open. And Georgetown still exists because of the relationship they had to slavery in that time and space. In the most recent years, they've really done a lot of work to engage in unpacking that history and really talking about how can they make up for both the sin that was committed, but then also what that has meant for generations of people who come later for access for education, for engaging in working in continuing their own growth, and even creating opportunities for scholarships for those who can trace their lineage back to those who were enslaved. US Catholic history also is challenging to us because of the way that we often connected with immigrant groups. The idea of a national parish was very common for many, many immigrant groups coming into the United States because it basically allowed them to keep their culture, to keep their ethnicity, to keep their space. But what that often meant was we were intentionally segregating these new immigrant groups into different parishes. And you don't have to go far in the United States to see this. If you go to any major city, particularly some of the Catholic hubs like Baltimore or Chicago or New Orleans, you'll see that segregation still exists in many of those neighborhoods today, where we have places that are called traditionally Black Catholic parishes, or parishes that have changed over time that were once, Eastern European communities and are now Hispanic or Latino parishes. That practice has helped to continue a sense of division and segregation in many of our own Catholic churches. And you can see that on Sunday mornings where, quoting the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Sundays is still the most segregated day of the week, Sunday mornings. And it's because our churches often struggle with the ability to integrate and welcome people from different communities. And then particularly when it comes to representation, we have to also wrestle with the fact that the leadership of our church does not necessarily reflect the diversity that we know exists in the church, particularly when you look at our clergy. That is a challenge that many dioceses have tried to address with programs to bring in priests from different countries to serve different communities, but it's still fraught with many challenges because for those who are born here in the United States, their experience of culture and church is very different than those who are immigrating from other countries, and particularly their experience of racism is very different. We also have some opportunities though within the church as well. Catholic social teaching is sort of the rock bed of how we can begin to address and talk about the issues of racism. As was shared in the video, racism is a life issue. So being pro-life means that you have to be anti-racist. It begs us to really wrestle with that fact that if we're going to really lift up the dignity of all human life, we have to really make sure that we are actively working, not just to say, I'm not a racist, but to work against racism. Because if it's so baked into our society, into our structures, into our organizations, it's not enough to just say, like, I'm not hurting anyone. The system itself is hurting people. The system itself is keeping people as inferior and lower down. So we have to actively work against it to try and build up a sense of justice and unity. Catholic means being universal. And it's something that we sometimes forget, but part of the reason I can be so proud of being Catholic is that we represent the most diverse religious community in the entire world. Diversity is part of who we are, and it's our DNA, and it's built into our identity. And we can tap into that diversity, not just internationally, but in our local communities as well. And finally, we've been addressing systemic issues as a church for a very long time, whether it's through the work that we see through Catholic Relief Services internationally and locally from the education side, Catholic charities, movements like the Catholic Worker Movement. We've been working at these issues and have a history of doing this work. So it's not new to us, and we can lean into that tradition and to those resources in very intentional ways. And more importantly, I think we always have an opportunity for encountering others and encountering the other. And the other, I use that term to sort of name the fact that we have to recognize both our own identity and also the identities that are not familiar to us, the identities of those who we may not have relationships with, that we are not connected to, but we are called as a community, as a church, to be a church of encounter. And so what does that look like? First off, encounter is based on building relationships, authentic relationships with individuals, and in this case, individuals who are different than ourselves. Some of that work may require us to do some work on our own, to educate ourselves on these issues, and particularly the systemic issues. We'll share a little bit, a resource handout that we've been putting together for a while, and it's not going to cover everything, but at least as a start to some of the resources that are out there to talk about and address these issues from different perspectives and from different mediums. So Lauren will share that a little later, and I'd be happy to put that in the chat too. We also have an opportunity to engage our church leadership in this, and this is different depending on where you're at and who you're connected to. But all of us as members of the body of Christ have to hold the larger body accountable. We have to engage in dialogue and engage in the questions. Are we talking about this? Are we actively addressing this as a community? What are our responses? And what is the church saying? We have a lot of history from this particular context here in the US, but there are lots of communities at the local level who are doing really wonderful work on this. Are we aware of that work? Are we engaging in that work at a local level? We have to identify the needs for intercultural competency. Intercultural competency is really understanding that the way that I see the world is often shaped by the lens of my culture. And understanding that other people's lens is going to be different than myself forces me to approach conversations, interactions, and working with others in very intentional ways. The USCCB has a really great resource for this. You can learn more about it on their website, but intercultural competency is some of the skills and tools that help addressing this work around diversity and inclusion, and particularly starting conversations about racism possible. You need to assess your realities. And I put some questions here that help us do a little bit of that work of assessing these and asking tough questions that sometimes help us unpack how we're really doing, because sometimes what we assume or how we feel we're doing doesn't really match up to the reality of our work. And finally, we have to make sure that we're not just talking about things that are on the peripheries of what we're doing, that we're really addressing root causes and systemic issues. CCHD, the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, is a really good example of that. I want to talk a little bit about how to enter into conversations and doing this work at the local level, because if you don't do anything else from an advocacy perspective, the thing that you can do is choose to engage in conversations. And there's some key things that we need to be doing in conversations that I think are really important. The first thing is we have to start with our own experiences, and we have to allow people to share their stories. The only way that we are going to really understand this, particularly if you are a person who has not had those experiences of racism, if you've never felt like you've been the victim of that, the only way that you can really learn is to hear other people. But as people are sharing their experiences and stories, we have to recognize that we're not listening to respond, to reply, to try and wait for what they're going to share so that we have a response. We have to really listen with the intention to understand. Understand that someone else's reality and experience may be very different and challenging to my own. Creating safe space is really, really important and can be really hard because we have to recognize that people are coming in wounded. And in sharing those stories and sharing their experiences, sometimes we're asking people to reopen those wounds that haven't always healed. We have to allow people to ask questions, and we have to allow people to be wrong. Charity is so, so important in this work. And being charitable to others is also recognizing that there was a time when I didn't know things, or I didn't understand the difficulties and the challenges at work here. And so allowing that space so that people can ask difficult questions, to be corrected on the language they're using or the impressions that they have or the ideas they have, that's really, really important. That's really important about creating that safe space. We have to be honest when we don't understand things, and it's okay to struggle. All of us are struggling here. And these are challenging conversations because if it was easy to figure out, we could have done something to fix this in our society and our church sooner. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, and we have to be honest with the deficiencies we have. We have to allow people to self-identify themselves. Language really is important, and depending on where you are in the country, certain terms, certain language is more appropriate than it is in others. I often, on the diversity inclusion end, we'll talk a little bit about this. It's not just about race, it's not just about ethnicity, but I think about our brothers and sisters who are differently abled or have disabilities. For a very long time, it was okay to use the R word, to use retarded. It was the technical term that was used in identifying that particular community and group. That is not okay anymore. Language changes, our culture changes. And so giving people the space to self-identify themselves is really important. Like allowing people to name themselves and who they are and how they identify is really key. And we have to be okay with being uncomfortable. These are all uncomfortable conversations. And I particularly appreciate our African-American brothers and sisters who have said, they don't want to talk about racism either. This isn't a comfortable conversation for them. This isn't fun for them. This is a lot of work. And so all of us have to be okay with a level of discomfort in doing this work. but we have to recognize it's important work and it's good work. Some of the don'ts: do not burden our African American brothers and sisters or people of color to fix this problem. We all have work to do. And I think it's particularly important for those of us who self-identify as white or European American, or are identified as white, who can pass as white, to sort of recognize that we all have important parts to do as allies in this work. And we cannot leave it for our brothers and sisters who are already carrying the wounds and the challenges of being victims of racism to also be the ones to have to fix it or teach us how to fix these problems. When I think of the broader scope of diversity and inclusion, we can't limit ourselves to just race or ethnicity. We have to always ask ourselves the question, who else is at the margins? I already mentioned those who are with disabilities or those who are differently abled. We have to think about our immigrants, those who speak different languages and don't speak English. A lot of the work around racism require us to do ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, because we're working with our brothers and sisters from different communities to really address these larger systemic issues. Sexuality and gender. There are lots of people who feel left out, and let's just name it, women, particularly in the church, feel particularly vulnerable in trying to engage in these roles and engage in these conversations, because oftentimes they're discounted because of who they are. We have to think about those who are in prison or in jail. And those systems in our society are unjust. If you just look at the numbers of those who are African American or people of color in jail versus the broader majority. We also have to keep in mind the elderly, the poor, the sick, those who are often at the margins and get lost in these conversations. Because if we're talking about issues of justice, all of us are struggling with this. And all of us have a role to play in dismantling these structures. Last but not least, we cannot center guilt. We have to center the voices of those who are most affected by racism, because often they are the ones who are closest to the solutions. But to get caught up in our own guilt, in our complacency, or in our identity really misses the opportunity to really lift up the voices of those who we need to be hearing in those moments, the ones who are living it and experiencing it, but often have some of the best solutions on how to address this as a community. Last but not least, I just want to highlight for us as Catholics, there was a really great article that was written by America Magazine a couple months ago that called us to really consider how we hunger for justice the same way that we hunger for the Eucharist will be the way that we fight racism. They highlight 5 key things that we could be doing. Repentance is important. Doing an examination of conscience, particularly how we engage on the issues of racism with others, I think is really important. And recognizing all of us are part of it, whether it's through our beliefs, our actions, our words, or the sins of omission, when we haven't stepped up, when we haven't called people out on their actions, on their hateful words, or things that they've said or done. Being in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, being there with them through the struggle, and also being present for them, being out there on the front lines. I've been really moved and touched by the number of young people who are at the forefront of these protests. And many of those young people are doing it because of their faith is motivating them. And so for us being there with them, being in solidarity with them, means showing up in those places where we can have the most effect. Forming ourselves and educating ourselves, not just on what the church teaches, but on how we are addressing racism and anti-racism work, I think is really, really important. And this is not a cop-out, but prayer is so, so key in this, because racism as a sin is not just a social issue, it's a spiritual issue. Those who are struggling with racist beliefs, with prejudice, we all are called to pray about this and to pray on how we can do better, because there is no way for us to really call ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ if we cannot see our brothers and sisters who are different than us as made in the image and likeness of God. And so we all have prayer that we need to do in this work. And so whether it's praying for ourselves, for our family members or friends who struggle with these concepts, these issues, or whether it's praying for the strength for ourselves to continue to do this work and have these difficult conversations. I think we're all called to do that. All right. I'm going to just throw this up here for a moment, knowing that if I keep my screen shared, I'm not going to be able to see everyone. So Just so you know, we have a number of resources on our website that I want to share. Again, it's not comprehensive, but we've done some of the work for you from finding articles, discussion guides, videos, webinars that have been out there. So you're welcome to visit our website for that. And my contact information is available here, and I'll also put it in the chat in case anybody wants to follow up. But I'm going to pass it on to Nick so that we can move into our question and comments section. And thank you guys for allowing me to share something.
Thanks so much, Darius. Don't mute yourself, because we're going to get going right now. We've got a lot of questions queued up as you take a drink there. Yeah. So the first one, and I'll start with something a little easier, hopefully, maybe, to get you warmed up. But, you know, the last couple of sessions that we've had have been about civic engagement and political engagement. And tonight we're talking about church engagement and church, you know, more internal church advocacy. So you're talking to a number of people who work in ministry, but there's a lot of young adults on here who are just, not just, but who do incredible work in their lives, but are really curious about what to do and what are the first small steps that they can take in this kind of internal advocacy. So what's your advice on small first steps? Where do you start?
So the first step that you can always do is ask questions. Asking questions allows you to open the door for some dialogue, but it also gets you some insights into how other people in your community, in your parish, in your Catholic institution are addressing, or even if they are talking about these issues. Once you have a better sense through relationships with people where this is at, then the next step is understanding who do we need to go to further this conversation. Because if you're not hearing about it, if you're not hearing about it from your priest or from the pulpit, if you're not seeing things written in your newsletter, it's very likely that people want to start conversations, but they don't know where to start. And so who are the influencers in your community? Is it your pastor? You know, is it your communications person who's posting all the social media up? But begin to talk to those people who have those connections, who have those relationships, to move the conversation and raise it up. If you're finding resistance from those individuals, then begin to start looking at the structure of your community or your organization and start figuring your way, how do I get to the top of that list? And so for many parishes, we automatically go to the pastor. But pastors have a lot on their plate right now. And so you might want to go to find out who are your parish council members? You know, who are the people who are helping the pastor make decisions about priorities or about what work is being done? Same thing in schools. You know, we often want to go straight to the principal, but there are other people who are responsible for the content that gets done, whether it's the individual teachers or catechists or the associate deans. One of the big issues that we are still not engaging with enough as a church is how this plays out in our HR practices, in human resources practices. That is a huge area around diversity and inclusion work that needs to be brought up. And if we're really living into our values of equal opportunities and lifting up diversity, we have to start from those basic things, because that's all stuff that happens in the background, but all of that plays into whose voices get heard, whose faces get seen in leadership and in the work that we're doing.
Great, thanks, Darius. I think that's really helpful. One of the questions I had is a follow-up from that one. You said to start by asking questions. And you mentioned a number of people there, but in your first part of who to ask questions, who are you thinking of? Who do you address those first questions to? Is that my friends and family, or is that somebody else? Who are you thinking?
Well, you got to start with yourself. And I really think those questions are the most challenging for us sometimes. It's uncomfortable to deal with the messiness of this, because once we start asking these difficult questions, how am I engaging with people? What are my biases? What are my blind spots around this issue? It really does force us to decide, if I recognize I'm deficient in some way, how am I going to get the help to address that? And who am I going to reach out to help me do that? The second person is our friends and family. And some of those times the conversations with our friends and family are the most difficult and the most challenging, because these are people we love. These are people that we are in close relationship with and proximity with. And sometimes calling people out on their bad language or their bad thoughts or their prejudiced actions can be really, really difficult, especially if you live with those people. So, you know, having those initial conversations helps us to do some of our work personally before we go into conversations within our parishes or within our communities. So starting with yourself and what is local is really important, because that will prepare you better to address those systemic and bigger community issues.
Okay. As another follow-up to this, and you addressed it a little bit earlier when you were talking about charity,
Mm-hmm.
but the question is, what do I do when I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing? What do I do about being afraid to say the wrong thing?
Say that like, I'm conscious that I don't know if this is the right thing to say, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. There's a level of humility that you have to have in entering into these work and conversations. We don't know all the answers, and we also don't know who is going to be receiving and listening to our message, where there might be certain things that do trigger them, you know, that do not fit well, are not okay. And so the more humility that we bring into the conversation, the more we're willing to come in to learn and open to learn, the more grace that people are going to be willing to extend to us. And I think it goes both ways. When we catch someone or somebody says something that we know is wrong or offensive, we can't jump all over them and say, that's wrong, that's terrible, how could you say that? We're all of us in different stages in the learning process. And so meeting people where they're at is really key in that. And if we are willing to be charitable to others, I often find people are very willing to be charitable to us.
Great. Okay, now I've got some harder questions.
Sounds good.
Or trickier, maybe they're a little trickier. I think they are. In response to the video you showed, so somebody was paying attention to the video, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think racism isn't ever included as a pro-life issue?
I think racism adds a lot of complexity to pro-life issues that I don't think we're always comfortable with addressing. Racism is at the heart of a lot of the other issues that are really symptoms to the bigger issue. If we go back to what racism is rooted in, it's that lack of understanding the basic dignity of each and every human person. And so if we were actually to ground more of our work in pro-life work on that, I think it would really open up a lot more opportunities for discussing the bigger issues, but also seeing how so many of these things are interconnected. Because you can't address racism in a systemic way without addressing all of the symptoms of that. Mass incarceration, poverty, food deserts, all of those things are symptoms and ripple effects of that. But I think we often forget that if the grounding of what we're doing isn't at the heart of that basic truth, the fundamental dignity of every human person, we miss that. And I think it's easy to just not want to couch it in that language, because racism is very divisive, particularly in our cultural context. Racism looks different here in the United States than it does anywhere else in the world. And we have to acknowledge that, because our history as a country is so tied into that institution and those systems that have been there since the very beginning. And so I think the taboo of the fact that we don't talk about it in society is also part of the reason why we don't talk about it in our church.
And one of the things that often comes up in some of these conversations is the idea of reparations. What does that mean?
Great question. I won't pretend to have all the answers to that. It's a technical term, but then there's also kind of the practical piece of it. So reparations as a concept is the idea that for what has happened in the past, what is the repayment to those communities, to the ancestors or the descendants of those who were enslaved? And that becomes a question of how organizations or governments or societies, how do we do the work of reparations? In the Catholic context, though, we call that restorative justice. We call that the reframing of being in just relationship with others. And so we as a church actually have a context and language to be able to talk about reparations. But the question is, how do we go to the people who have been most hurt and offended and say, how do we make this relationship right again? And sometimes that is in the form of particular, whether it's financial payment or, opportunities for access to things that those communities don't have access to. That's how it looks like within the societal section or realm. But within the church realm, like we have a lot of work to do in this area as well. And I find it interesting, reparations, because it's such a polarizing term. Even like the community in Georgetown has avoided using that language in the work that they're doing because it has been very politicized. But the work that they're doing in so many ways is reparations, creating a fund for the descendants of those who were enslaved so that they would have access to university education. That is an example of what reparations can look like. But I think that they're very honest about that this is part of their commitment as an organization, as the Jesuits and as a university, to making up for the sins of their past.
So there's a follow-up to that as well. So thank you for that first part. The follow-up is just where you were leading, right? So we have the example of Georgetown doing reparations, whether they call it that or not. What are some ways that you would encourage parishes, dioceses, religious communities, apostolates to begin that work of reparations? Where do they start, and how do we go about doing that?
I would lean on two basic ideas. The first is you don't know how to repair a relationship if you are not actively engaged in relationship with those who have been hurt. And so if you're going to start somewhere, you need to start with those who have been most affected by the actions that have left people out. I think secondly, we also have to then make a active and intentional commitment as communities to lift up those who have often been marginalized or disenfranchised. We often talk in church language about preferential options for the poor, preferential option for the young. Then within our institutions or in our communities, making a preferential option for our African-American brothers and sisters, for our Latino brothers and sisters. It's not out of line, because what it's showing is that we are lifting up and putting at the center of the work that we do those voices that are often not heard. And so that is within our tradition. That is something that we can do and that we should do. But I think answering that concern or that question, how do we repair that relationship? It only comes from actually being in relationship with the people who feel left out.
Great. And Timon just added something here in the chat bar that's a really important part of this conversation. So I'm going to lift that up right here. How do we make sure to include the conversation around white privilege alongside that conversation with reparations in a church context? What does white privilege mean within our church context?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is white privilege as a term probably needs some definition. And I think it's really hard because there's a lot that's tied to that term. But what I often remind people, privilege isn't a bad thing. Privilege in itself is kind of like grace. It's something that we receive that we didn't earn, we didn't do anything for it, and we're just blessed to have it. And so when we talk about white privilege, we have to remember that the privilege in itself is not the problem. It's the way that it's used to then sometimes hold other people down or to take away from others to give to those who are being privileged. So my question is often, how do we talk about white privilege? Well, one of the questions is, how are you using that privilege? Are you using that privilege, if you are white, to allow your brothers and sisters who are often not listened to be heard? Are you using that privilege to center other voices and giving the floor, sometimes whether it's in a meeting or conversations or bringing up those concerns that sometimes our brothers and sisters who can't be in the room, bringing those up to the forefront? Again, privilege isn't bad in itself. It's the question of how are we using it? And then finally, white privilege, whether you're comfortable with the term or not, I would point to a really important and really helpful article that talks about white privilege as sort of the invisible knapsack or a backpack. There are all sorts of things that you don't have to think about as a white person in this society or in this culture that people of color have to think about all the time. That prayer earlier was a good reminder of that. I hope the color of my skin doesn't get me killed or doesn't make me the target, you know, of some sort of violence or you know, some sort of racist act. So those are the things that when we're lifting up white privilege. And then as a church, we also have to recognize that this church was built on that reality of slavery that helped to build up a lot of the wealth, not just of the Catholic Church as a whole, but in this country in particular. And so whether we recognize it as privilege or not, the Catholic Church here in the United States would not exist without those privileges that have come there. And so I think that's also a challenge for us to have to really dig deep into that and sort of say, how do we then not center that reality, that whiteness? How do we allow space for others?
There's we have more questions coming in than we're probably going to have time to get to, but I'm going to push two of them together here. One is around, you know, aligning our communities and leadership to the diverse, you know, communities that we live in. How do you balance that alignment without the, or how do you balance that alignment with the idea of tokenism? Where does that part come in? Which I think also leads into another question that I've received around how do we not fall into, those of us who are white or European American, not fall into a white savior mode when it comes to the use of privilege or not using privilege. So I think those are kind of tied together, the tokenism question and that white savior issue. Can you address that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think tokenism is a challenge because tokenism is not ideal, but sometimes it's the best starting point. And I say that because in some of our communities, we may find ourselves not feeling or being very diverse. And so you're making an intentional effort to try and center those voices, but you don't always have those individuals engaged in who you are as a community or the work that you're doing. So you got to start somewhere. But I go back to tokenism. The problem is when tokenism, when it focuses on just getting somebody who is of that community there because you need them. Because what it does is it narrows the person's identity down to one thing, not the totality of their gifts. And so tokenism fails because it often puts people in positions that they are set up to fail. They are set up to not be able to do anything more than just be a face when we are so much more than that. So how do you avoid tokenism? Part of it is that you work in relationship with people to make sure that your steps, your actions are not just what you think is best, but are actually what the community is asking for and needing from you in that moment. To make that assumption that I know what's best for this other community or this other group of people, that's a very poor assumption to make. And so if you want to use your privilege well, always pair that with who are the people that I am in conversation with who help inform the things that I say, the things that I share, the things that I'm advocating for. Because if you are in a place of privilege, you are not closest to the problems and issues that are there.
Great. Thank you, Darius. One last question before we wrap up here as we approach the 9 o'clock hour here on the East Coast. We have addressed this question to both of our previous guests, and it's how do you balance action and prayer? And I want to add to that, how do we make sure to see the sin of racism not only as a political issue, but a part of our Christian call to combat racism? So how do you personally balance action and prayer? And how have you moved from seeing it just as a political issue to one of your Christian faith?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is you can't do this work if you are not fully in tune with your creator. Because at the end of the day, for me, this is not about, this isn't about politics. This is about, if I really say that I'm a believer and follower of Jesus Christ, then I have to put it upon myself to really wrestle with the fact that I am called to love my brother and sister. I am also called to love my enemy. I am called to love the foreigner and the stranger. And for me, it's not an issue of this being politics. It's an issue about me being a disciple. If I'm not willing to do that work, to wrestle and struggle with that uncertainty of those feelings, I'm not doing my job as a disciple. I'm not living into those values. So I have to pray about it. I have to pray about it. And particularly the last few months, I've had to pray about it daily, because it is not easy to enter into those conversations. And I feel very privileged, as somebody who self-identifies as a person of color, as a Latino, very light-skinned as I am. I get to facilitate and enter into conversations with people in all different spaces and places. And that's a privileged space to be in. But I'd be lying to say if it wasn't tiring sometimes to do that work. And so we have to acknowledge that it's only by the grace of God that any of this is possible. To move it into gospel, and it is gospel. This is not, I don't have to spend a lot of time making the separation between politics. I know for others it is, but this is about loving our brothers and sisters. This is about being in solidarity with the marginalized, the left behind, the disenfranchised. And that's gospel message to me. I don't have to look very hard in the gospels to find that example from Jesus Christ himself. And you don't have to look far from the early church of the disciples on who they cared for and who they were in place. My grandfather's a deacon, and so I often point to that, that example. That position in the church was created in service of the community and of the people. And so if there was a need in the early church to make sure that the widows, the orphans, the disenfranchised were cared for, and they built a canonical and clerical position to do that work, it shouldn't seem so foreign or separate from us. So for me, yeah, I get it. It's hard in our particular society to divide those things up, but for me, it's very simple. Jesus said it. I got to do it. Let's figure out a way to live it.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren here to wrap us up tonight.
Darius, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for your time and for the truth and wisdom that you shared with us this evening. We're really grateful, and we'll be sending more people your way. There were a lot of questions coming in that we're thankful for this time together, but continued conversation for sure. We'll be back here, same time, same place next week with Dr. Timon Davis for our fourth and final young adult advocacy training, Discerning Your Voice in the Power of Story. Also be on the lookout for the recordings. Nick will send those out this week, and we'll also have them up on our Instagram and Facebook pages. But thank you all each for joining us and giving of your time to continue this conversation. We will see you all next week.